The object that our team has chosen to focus our story is a tool that was used to embed the principles of participatory research in a national project of research in Canada. And while the ethical guidelines that we'll talk about are specific to Aboriginal research, participatory methods that they embody gained acceptance more broadly after the project ended. I will tell the story of drafting and implementing ethical guidelines for research in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, 1991 to 1996. Jeff and Fred will share their observations of how the principles continued to shape practice after the original project ended. Royal commissions in Canada are appointed at times when issues of public importance threaten the nation's peace and stability. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state had risen to the level of national concern in the latter decades of the 20th century. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who identify as Indigenous make up 5% of the population, 1,800,000 in a nation of 37 million that stretches across 7,000 kilometers from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans and north from the United States border to the Arctic. Canada became a self-governing nation in 1967 by way of legislation of the British Parliament. The British North America Act set out the terms joining distinct provinces into a federal union that became Canada. The BNA Act continued to be the foundational document of Canadian governance and identity for more than 100 years. And in the BNA Act, one of the powers assigned exclusively to the federal government was to make laws for Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. The Indian Act of 1876 established colonial control over every aspect of Indian life. A series of treaties opened homelands to settlers and development, while the Indians who lived there were allotted plots of reserve land out of the path of settlement. As settlers originally from Europe were harvesting the natural resources of the country to build farms and industries and trade, Indigenous people were being pushed further to the margins of a changing society. The legal status of Aboriginal peoples changed fundamentally with the patriation of the Canadian Constitution from Britain to Canada and the enactment of the Constitution Act of 1982, creating the first made in Canada Constitution. Section 35 in the Canadian Constitution provides that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. This meant that the public policy designed to erase the distinctiveness of Aboriginal peoples was no longer legitimate, although the stated policy of some of the senior people in the Department of Indian Affairs was to continue until there were no Indians and no Indian problem. Constitutional recognition implied an opportunity to renew the historic relationship of peace and friendship between peoples envisioned in historic treaties. Some legislation after the patriation of the Constitution was introduced, but not a lot changed in the daily lives of Aboriginal people. Legal debates and conferences on the meaning and scope of Aboriginal rights affirmed in the Constitution continued without resolution through the 1980s. Conflict continued to erupt over past and present injustices and unsettled land disputes. The isolation of Indigenous communities had been breaking down. The small tracts of lands reserved to them away from the earlier path of settlement were insufficient to support life. They mounted protests over violation of sacred treaties that they believed created enduring responsibilities on all sides of the treaties. They claimed entitlement to traditional territories that were never surrendered. They felt threatened by proposals of governments and corporations to extract oil and minerals from contested lands or build dams to divert rivers that were arteries of their lives. In international forums, Canada was criticized for failure to address inequality. Violent civil rights conflicts in the United States were provoking uncomfortable comparisons in the minds of Canadian citizens. Public opinion was divided between concern to resolve the Indian problem and those urging governments to suppress oppressed. The tipping point, demanding action, occurred in 1990 when violence erupted in Oka, Quebec. Members of a small Mohawk community mounted resistance against efforts of a neighboring town to build a golf course on disputed land which contained a burial ground. Police were called, and one of them died in an exchange of gunfire. The confrontation escalated with reinforcements from the Canadian militia and self-identified warriors from other communities joining the resistance. Media accounts and photos went around the world. Canadians watched in shock and disbelief at the sight of armed forces, tanks, and surveillance helicopters deployed against a few dozen Indians surrounded by barbed wire in a health treatment center. Aboriginal leaders counseled restraint. Federal and provincial political leaders recognized the risk of confrontations springing up elsewhere. The standoff continued for 78 days before dispersing, with a few arrests, but no further casualties. 1 year later, in 1991, the Prime Minister announced the appointment of a royal commission to study the evolution of the relationship among Aboriginal peoples, the Canadian government, and Canadian society as a whole. The commission was to propose solutions to persistent problems that have troubled those relationships and which continue even today. 7 commissioners were appointed. 4 of them were Indigenous persons. They were given a 5-year mandate to prepare a report to the Government of Canada that could potentially reset relations. I was appointed co-director of research, along with a scholar of settler origin, to launch a research program that would lay the ground for a report that could win support in Canadian society as a whole. That's an ambitious goal, and authentically represent the reality of Indigenous peoples. In our earliest efforts at consultation, we convened a workshop of 80 community researchers who brought lived experience in political organizations, support for land claims litigation, and earlier dialogue on the Constitution of Canada. A few were students preparing for professional roles in community service. In the opening session of the workshop, we were met with a wave of criticism about results of past initiatives and doubts about the usefulness of research in general. Participants raised the cry, "We've been researched to death." My co-director and I were well aware of the frequent disconnect between the perspectives of Aboriginal people and reports prepared by researchers from outside the community. Each of us had developed our own approach to respectful community collaboration. In my case, I found that principles and methods from adult education were very effective in my teaching in Indigenous studies at Trent University and development projects with First Nation communities. The language of participatory research and ethical guidelines was not in common use within the Royal Commission, among community researchers, or in the Aboriginal community. In 1991, it just wasn't known. Over time, participatory research became familiar and used in communication with professionals, although Indigenous researchers tend to retain terms drawing on cultural references, such as two-eyed seeing or doing research in a good way, rather than codified rules. To reach into the hearts and minds of people, in communities, we needed to break through the distrust and deliver assurance that RCAP, the acronym that became used, that it would do research differently. We turn to elders whose wisdom and skills are often called upon by younger leaders. A small group agreed to meet in caucus with me to draw on their experience over many years to develop guidance for new research that would avoid errors of the past and enable respectful relations. I was familiar with working with elders, but it was really an eye-opener for me that to discover the depth of the elders' insight, the clarity of their specific advice, and the way in which that advice was directly transferable to the format of a pocket-sized manual of guidelines for research to reflect the perspectives of Aboriginal participants and the need to reconsider sources, methods, and interpretations of research. The first principle, which I've asked Juan Mario to put up as a sample, the first principle affirms that Aboriginal peoples have distinct perspectives and understandings deriving from their cultures, histories, and languages. Research touching Aboriginal experience must reflect these understandings. The second principle states that past research has usually been carried out by non-Aboriginal personnel, and Aboriginal peoples have had no opportunity to correct misinformation or challenge racist interpretations. Therefore, and this is a direct violation of most of the principal rule that new researchers are always asked to declare what's in the existing body of research. And the guidelines say those existing research products must be open for reassessment. The specific practice guidelines could be required or recommended. For example, in studies located principally in Aboriginal communities, researchers shall establish collaborative procedures to enable community representatives to participate in the planning, execution, and evaluation of research results. Oral knowledge must be acknowledged as a valuable research resource along with documentary and other sources. The means of validating knowledge in the particular traditions under study should normally be applied to establish authenticity of orally transmitted knowledge. Due consideration to community benefit and transfer of skills to increase the capacity of the community to manage its own research is recommended. Implementation directives provide that these guidelines shall be included in all research contracts sponsored by the Commission. It shall be the responsibility of all researchers to observe these guidelines conscientiously, and the responsibility of research managers and the co-directors of research to monitor the implementation. Over the course of 3 years, 350 research projects were commissioned, including 100 community studies and 30 Indigenous organizations. With the priority on transfer of skills and oversight by communities, it's reasonable to assume that multiple participants in each community and organization were introduced to participatory research methods. Principal investigators in diverse professions and universities agreed to comply with the guidelines. Caution was occasionally voiced by career researchers that collaboration between researchers and subjects throughout the process might bias results. Peer review by both Indigenous and academic reviewers was enlisted to evaluate results. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples submitted its 5-volume report in 1996 with 440 recommendations covering the major sectors of Indigenous life and setting out proposals to resolve long-standing problems. The government of the day judged the recommendations too costly to implement. This response, as you can imagine, was a huge disappointment to the hundreds of RCAP personnel and associates and numberless people in the communities who had devoted their efforts over months and years to achieving systemic change. But the story didn't end with the federal government sidelining RCAP's final report. There were major issues. One was the relocation of a whole Inuit community to the furthest reaches of the Arctic as a sovereignty defining statement. And the recommendations, the research of the Royal Commission promoted and was responsible for a review of that administrative movement and apology and reparations. The principal commitment to action on review of the report was creation of an Aboriginal Healing Fund administered by Indigenous representatives to address the long-term and intergenerational trauma inflicted on individuals who had been confined as children in residential schools. Public concern continued and expanded with further revelations of abuse in the residential school era and led to the appointment of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2015, the TRC issued 94 calls to action, many of them echoing RCAP recommendations of 20 years later, 20 years earlier. But this time, the action calls from the TRC reached out and moved Canadians in all walks of life. Each RCAP recommendation was accompanied by strategies for implementation, and these were taken up by Indigenous leaders to support negotiations, especially with governments on local control and self-government, while community workers and services looked to recommendations on health and education and communication and an Indigenous operated television station. So there were many piecemeal but important outcomes of the research that although it was sidelined, it wasn't ignored. RCAP's ethical guidelines for research lived on because they attracted the attention of other bodies interested in ethics and Aboriginal research. I formally retired after RCAP was dispersed, but Jeff and Fred carried on the fight, and they will pick up the story from here. And I think Jeff is going to start chapter 2. Thank you.